Was this person crying? Oh, no, never mind. There we go. Look at that. Look at that. Double input. Jump in the air, frozen in the air.
Before we start, here are the stats. Now that's settled, let's go. So what is Valkie 64? Well, it's an action-adventure game made by a single developer named Glade? I hope I'm saying that right. Anyway, the game came out in 2022, to not overwhelmingly positive reviews. Now, being a solo dev of any kind is not easy, so being the artist, programmer, and overall designer for something as labor-intensive as a video game is a commendable feat. However, the reviews are kinda right. The game's not amazing. It's not terrible by any means, it's just serviceable. Let's break it down. I would usually want to talk about the gameplay first, but let's leave that for later. For now, let's talk about the obvious. This game is obviously inspired by Ocarina of Time. Does that mean it's a bad thing? Of course not. Inspiration, no matter how obvious, is perfectly acceptable as long as it's not trying to demean whatever it's based off of or outright steal from it. The low poly models with low resolution textures all point to trying to emulate Ocarina of Time back in the Nintendo 64 days. Other than the resolution of the game being far higher than anything the N64 can render, visually, you can make the argument that it could slot into Ocarina of Time with minimal issues, even if some of the designs are a bit simple. So yeah, in terms of art style, it's great, but the level design of the world needs work. Specifically, it needs to be smaller. An easy criticism to make of Ocarina of Time, and other Zeldas, is that running through Hyrule Fields is a chore. At the time, a giant open space to walk through was a mind-blowing thing to see in a video game. Nowadays, you can't really help but notice just how actually barren it is. The 4 worlds you visit are great looking visually, but traversing them can get annoying when you consider how much of the gameplay is dedicated to just running through them. There are 2 big ones per region, and other than finding a chest or 2 in them, there's not much to them. The game doesn't involve too much backtracking, and it's overall pretty short, so I would say it's not that huge of an issue, but it's still pretty noticeable. The temples themselves are fine, not reaching the zenith of the Inspirations dungeons by any means, but perfectly acceptable for the low scale the game is working with. So yeah, in terms of the game's strongest point, I would say it's the visuals for sure. Just like in a typical Zelda game, Valkie, in the spirit of Link, only makes noises in the sounds of hit and jump barks. They're rather soft grunts, especially compared to Link, who has moves will scream off the top of his lungs to get a hit in, but it's basic enough to give the illusion of effort on Valkie's end. There's no talking at all otherwise, which is just as well as the NPCs aren't exactly brimming with interesting dialogue. The sound effects are nice enough in their attempts to sound Zelda-like, but they are rather stock. Likewise, the music does set up the atmosphere in the levels appropriately, but, and I am sorry if this isn't the case, I imagine the songs are just bought assets, as they do sound rather generic. There's nothing wrong with that, solo dev and all, so use what you have available. That being said, I do think the audio could use another round of mixing. Some effects, like the parry move, are blatantly too loud and pop out distinctively to the point of distraction. The music is noticeably loud as well, which is sometimes loud enough to just drown out all the other noises. This must be a known issue, as through an update they added an option to change the music in preset values, which is really odd as a settings option.
Parry, pause, music. Music. Wait, that's the setting?
Overall, the sound design is not particularly great or terrible. It's just kinda there. The story is an excuse. There's a goddess of chaos and order, they fought, chaos got sealed away. As the last member of the Guardians of Order, or maybe you were dead and got revived, the wording's a bit weird, go defeat the goddess of chaos. That's all you really get for an overarching story, and that's told in the beginning of the game. The goddess statue here will guide you by presenting which worlds to go through for an eastern experience, but like, none of the NPCs really talk about that? They're just kinda chilling in their villages and aren't particularly stressed out either about the whole goddess situation, or even really the problem plaguing their temples. Only the village chief seems to care. There's not a real sense of urgency or scale for the players to immerse themselves in, since it's barely even acknowledged. As such, the story is just an excuse to progress through the game, and thus not really worth talking about. Oh boy. The gameplay is easily the biggest problem. My main issue with the sound design and story would be easy to handwave off, as they're not game-breaking by any means. But this is a game, and the best way I can describe the game is playable. If by chance you never played a Zelda game, here's the gameplay. You run around the world, swing your sword to defeat enemies, clear the dungeons of bosses, get your magical plot items, and go beat the final boss. Valkie 64 does exactly this, yet it feels like it's not fully implemented, particularly the combat. What do I mean? Well, you have two primary buttons used to attack. Heck, you can even combo with them. But that's not important. These attacks work in causing damage, but two things are off about them. One, when you hit the enemy has little to no hit stun, and two, the enemy's hit and hurt boxes are inconsistent. These two problems create a scenario where an enemy can just hit you while you're attacking. And you only have the sword. You have no range options of any kind, nor tools to use, unlike a normal Zelda game. So you must get in close to attack enemies. It's just bad feeling. I guess the original intention was to dodge them using its version of the Z targeting system from Ocarina, but because of the wonky hitboxes, I found I was relying on the game's frankly overpowered parry, which, as I found out through making this video, was added in through a patch. As for the rest of the gameplay, there's not a lot to it. The Legend of Zelda prides itself on multiple things, from its puzzle dungeons, to having cool items to use, even having great stories with memorable characters. But here, not really. It's unfair to have its inspiration as a comparison point, but ultimately the gameplay is only slightly better than the absolute minimum from what you'd expect from any action-adventure. The janky combat is the worst problem, but even then, there's not a lot else to the game. If the game wasn't so short, I'd imagine my opinion on it would be far lower. Valkie 64 is a good example of why copying an amazing game is difficult. It looks like Ocarina of Time, but it's missing many of the features that makes Ocarina special. The temples don't really have puzzles for them, the story's non-existent, the combat is very limited, and there are some fascinating bugs that I'm curious about how they even work.
What?
There are basic things that are just missing. Like, I haven't made a game in a long time that's just missing basic settings. I can't change the sound level or resolution. I just started the game at full screen. In a full studio game, that would be unacceptable. But from a single dev, there are a ton of tutorials on making settings, and I don't know. Yet, despite all that, it does have a certain charm to it. Sometimes when you play a game, you can feel when someone puts genuine effort and love into their creation. And I must give some level of slack for being a solo project. Yes, we've had games made by solo developers that are amazing quality and highly polished, but that's a rarity. Is it aiming for the sky? No. And that's ultimately what stays my hand on saying it's just bad. It aims small, wanted to make something more akin to a love letter than any kind of spiritual successor, and I think it's great for that alone. It's very rough and needs some streamlining and tuning up to push it from mediocre to acceptable, but he made a game. For someone that has nothing under their belt before this, that's very impressive. However, at the end of the day, I have to judge the game regardless of any kind of context, as it is a product. On its own, Valkie 64 needs a lot of polish to make a better overall experience. If you wanted a fleshed out Zelda-like, this isn't it. Go play Darksiders 1 or Okami if you want to try that experience. As an indie action-adventure game, there are better options. However, if you want to support a dev who's essentially made a fan game to one of the most influential video games of all time, consider giving it a look. You might find the charm in it just like I did.